Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to look at the ways in which people pushed back against the direction American society was changing and to see a rise of conservatism that went along with the more sort of liberal culture of the 1920s. And so, as we of course know, massive societal change creates opportunity for some and opposition for others. And so we of course are going to see some significant pushback to all of these developments that came out of the aftermath of World War I. So today we're going to look at the reasons why conservatives pushed back on these things. We're going to assess the success of the Scopes monkey trial. And then we're going to look at the rise of the quote unquote new Klan and discuss how it differs to some extent from previous iterations of this hate group. So let's dive in. One of the things that we see really come of age in the 1920s is something called religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the idea that we need to get back to literal biblical interpretations and traditional conservative principles. And so they felt like the scientific growth of this time period had led to the growth of something called modernism, which is the idea that you need to interpret the Bible through more of a modern lens and incorporate in new societal developments, lest Christianity becomes sort of a niche religion and become less relevant to people's lives. And so there was this massive push between modernists who want to modernize and sort of adapt Christian teaching versus fundamentalists who want to really focus on the sort of traditional pieces of Christianity. With obviously fundamentalists feeling like if we go this direction and start to use these sort of scientific principles to examine religion, who knows where it's going to lead? And at some point they were worried that, of course, if you start taking any bricks out of the this sort of traditional religious model, the whole thing could come crashing down. Fundamentalists used the new medium of radio to reach more of their audience. Specifically, of course, radio preachers being able to provide reach a much larger audience than they would have been able to previously. And so we start to see a national culture of fundamentalism develop, whereas previously, of course, you'd be limited to sort of your own congregation in spreading and developing these ideas. The biggest example of this battle is the Scopes monkey trial. It's called the Scopes monkey trial because, one, it's about the legitimacy of teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, and also because it was an absolute circus. And so Tennessee had passed a law basically banning the teaching of evolution. And so the ACLU and their key attorney, Clarence Darrow, pictured here, wanted a test case to basically figure out if this Tennessee law was legitimate. And so they found a substitute teacher who was willing to assign a reading that mentioned evolution, violating the law. And now we've got our case where fundamentalists want all of this sort of Darwinist nonsense out and want stuff more focused on traditional interpretations, whereas modernists want to try to incorporate these theories in. So the champion for the fundamentalists is William Jennings Bryan here for his last sort of hurrah on the scene, using his spectacular oratorial technique to try to basically undermine the case again for evolution. The case itself is just an absolute fiasco. In the end, Darrow is spending all his time trying to disprove Bryan's faith, and Bryan is using his traditional oratorial flourishes to try to get the crowd on his side. And we have this ridiculous exchange by which Darrow is questioning Bryan about the legitimacy of Jonah being swallowed by a whale, and Bryan responds something like, "I believe in a God who can make a man and a whale and make them do what he pleases." And so in the end, nothing is actually settled. Both sides feel like they won the case. The court ruled against Scopes without sort of moving into the broader question here, not setting a precedent. And then Scopes was fined, but then the fine was he was not required to pay it. And so the Scopes monkey trial mainly just demonstrated the tension between the two sides and the pointlessness of this debate in general. We also get pushback towards prohibition with the rise of the speakeasy, which leads to some significant problems in American society. Obviously, trying to ban the supply of alcohol did not ban the demand, and so it pushed it underground into these black markets. And we get a rise of bootlegging and rum running. Bootlegging, of course, being the illegal production of alcohol, and rum running being bringing in alcohol from Canada, from Mexico, from other places, in order to sell it for a significant profit. The Volstead Act was the federal act that was supposed to cut down on prohibition, but it faced the same problems that so many Gilded Age acts faced, in that the people who were actually charged with prosecuting these acts were paid so little that they were very, very susceptible to bribery, and this became incredibly common, and the enforcement was incredibly ineffective. All of this became tied up in organized crime, as of course most of these sort of black market fields do. And so you get these crime syndicates controlling these bootleg empires within American cities with, threats of violence, actual violence, extortion, all this fun stuff. Of course, the quintessential example of this is Al Capone, our furniture dealer, quote unquote, from Chicago, who ran this massive criminal empire until he was brought down for not paying his taxes in what may have been a pretty shaky governmental case. But it doesn't matter. Capone went to jail, and his empire continued to operate, for the most part, without him. We also get the rise of the new Klan, quote unquote. The new Klan is different from the old Klan in that it's a much less invisible empire. Here we see the Klan parading down Pennsylvania Avenue. Here we see advertisements for the Klan in Wichita, Kansas. And here we see, a tongue-in-cheek political cartoon about some northerner who his wife has now discovered that he's a Klan member, and she seems very nonchalant about this. So here's what's different about the new Klan. The new Klan becomes much more socially acceptable and becomes much more prominent in areas of the North, pushing back both against new immigrant groups and African Americans. And so it honestly becomes, there's still the terrorist pieces of it, but it also becomes partially a political organization, pushing for conservative laws and things like that. And they also push to enforce prohibition. And so the new Klan is, I don't want to say more family friendly, because there's still like the undercurrents of terrorism and killing African Americans. But at least for American society, it starts to become more acceptable, which is a little terrifying. A lot of this, especially the northern activity, leads to de facto segregation, where African Americans, there's no specific laws forcing them into communities. But again, the fear of terrorism and informal practices end up creating high concentrations of African Americans within specific neighborhoods. For example, here you see the expansion of the south side of Chicago, which was one of the more famous African American neighborhoods. And we'll discuss Harlem in New York City when we get to the Harlem Renaissance momentarily. The NAACP pushes back against this, and pushes back against the new Klan in general. But as usual, most of society is not paying attention. And we also get the rise of Black nationalism, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, with Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association basically proposing a return to Africa for Black people, which was not very popular amongst most Black people in the United States. So the other group criticizing modern society is the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation was a group of artists and writers who had lived through World War I and been profoundly disenchanted with society. All of the sort of higher callings that they felt like defined American culture and human life, sort of the veneer had been ripped away because of their horrible experiences in the trenches. And so they write much more about trying to search for meaning in life and sort of the hopelessness of life in general. This leads to a push called existentialism and surrealism, with existentialism being the basic idea that there is no overarching meaning to life except the meaning that you yourself find and create. And so rather than living for any specific higher calling, you need to figure out I'm having trouble even describing it. You need to decide like what gives your life meaning and then pursue that, as opposed to any sort of traditional outside calling. Surrealism tries to break our understanding of the modern world by breaking the laws of it. And so in these things, and then, modernism, which I'm not even going to get anywhere near modernism. we start to see critiques of traditional society and an attempt to build sort of an alternate understanding. So that brings us to through all these critiques of modern society. So hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And when we come back, we'll look at the rest of the Roaring Twenties and how society was transformed.